Ready, and we'll welcome everybody to Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema. This is class number 7 of course 2, and we're going to be talking about Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society and Movement. So Theosophy is both an organization called the Theosophical Society. It's founded in 1875. I'll say more about that in a moment. But it also can be used to designate an international movement or a kind of subculture or a kind of a zone of cultural influence or a set of ideas that is extremely influential in the continued development of Western esotericism. In fact, it would probably not be an exaggeration to say that Theosophy is the single major movement in terms of influence, number of people involved, number of publications, amount of activity going on around it in the late 19th and even to some extent the early 20th century. And Theosophy is involved in, but also a response to and criticism of something called spiritualism, which again we'll talk about in a moment. But it also has its own trajectory, set of ideas and principles. Because of its complexity, there's a number of things we could talk about today that we're going to de-emphasize because there's a few particular issues or themes that I want to focus on that directly relate to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which we'll be talking about next week, and also the development of Thelema and the inheritance from Theosophy into Thelema. So we're not so much going to be covering, we'll say a little bit about the so-called secret doctrine, which is the occult system of Theosophy. But we're not going to say this is extremely complicated, and we're not actually going to go so much into that. What I'd instead want to focus on is the idea of the ascended Mahatmas or spiritual masters, which is presumed to be part of the core myth of Theosophy. And I say presumed for reasons which I'll explain in a moment. And then I'm hoping we'll also have time to say something about what Blavatsky's ultimate philosophical position is. What is the absolute, so to speak, in her system that the basic underlying position behind her sometimes extremely convoluted elaborations of multicultural esoterica that she weaves together in her various works. What's the payoff? What's her ultimate position? And then say something about how that does and does not, moving forward, relate to Thelema and its ultimate philosophical position. Okay, so Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, her dates are 1831 to 1891. She is born in the Russian Empire. She's part of a minor noble family that is in the territory of the Ukraine within the Tsarist Russian Empire. And she has various family members who are involved in larger esoteric interests. So occultism is something that is already part of her family background. And so she would have already learned from members of her family who are part of something called the strict observance, fringe or high grade type of Freemasonry, deriving from Europe, where there's the idea that there's secret, you could call them masters. They were the secret head of the particular Masonic initiatory groups. And this is part of the whole ferment of fringe masonry in the earlier 19th and late 18th centuries, where there's a revival, for example, of the myth of the Templars. So certain forms of high-grade Freemasonry were said to be survivals of the Knights Templar. There's a anti-Catholic element to some of this. So certain Protestant esotericists who are politically opposed to Catholic despotism, the kind of remnants of the Counter-Reformation. We're talking about that in earlier classes. They get involved in Masonry to promote certain Enlightenment ideals. And this gets conflated with these radical Enlightenment, democratic and anti-authoritarian, sometimes anti-colonial ideals get conflated and combined with ideas that there's a kind of a group of advanced adepts who possess magical and esoteric knowledge, who are secretly at work to bring about the enlightenment of society. And these are then the secret masters or secret chiefs of certain, said to be related to certain Masonic rites, sometimes figures such as Cagliostro, who presented himself as one of these masters and had an Egyptian rite of Freemasonry that taught certain types of ceremonial magic, mostly ways to have seances and have visionary experiences where you communicate with angels or spirits that can communicate information to you. This, of course, goes back to John Dee as well, who's also trying to do this. He's often identified as one of these figures. This is often associated with the myth of the Rosicrucian order, which is said to survive in various forms, again, in this kind of network of adepts. Now, what's interesting about that is that it's both a myth, but there's also a kind of reality to the myth, which is that there are actual esoteric adepts, people who are knowledgeable in the teachings of Western esotericism, magical practice, and so forth, all of which are real teachings and practices. And there's real people who are actually magically adept at these things. And they are involved in radical enlightenment activities. And so the myth of the secret chiefs is also a cover for actual political activities that, because of their revolutionary character, have to remain clandestine, that actual people are actually doing. And so what I'm going to be claiming, and I've got some scholarship here that I'll be showing you to back this up, is that Blavatsky's mythology of the Great White Brotherhood, the ascended Mahatmas that are the origin of the teaching, she alleges, of the Theosophical Society, that this is a cover story to conceal the very real activities of an international network of politically radical esotericists that she was part of and had been part of for many years in her travels throughout the world, prior to her becoming more publicly known with the founding of the Theosophical Society. And so she does, in fact, have a mission on behalf of this actually existing network of adepts that she is part of and is in correspondence with and involved in their activities. But she creates this cover story of, by masking the real identities of these figures with mythologized other characters. And then the myth kind of takes over from the reality. So there's usually two interpretations of Blavatsky's myth of the Great White Brotherhood. There's the skeptical interpretation, which is that it's all a bunch of hooey, and there are no such masters. And then there's the true believer approach, which is that it's all true, and the skeptics represent dark forces of the Black Lodges who are attempting to interfere with the mission of the masters, et cetera, et cetera. these two alternatives prevent the recognition that there is this third option, which is that there is an international network of occult adepts who are involved in legitimate and explicit attempts to further an agenda of what I'm calling radical enlightenment. And I'll have more to say about what that means in a minute, but who are attempting to transform and evolve human society in constructive ways and form a kind of network, more or less officially or unofficially, with each other. These are real people in real correspondence with each other, engaged in actual activities to try to do stuff in the world. But that the myth of the ascended masters is a kind of cover for that. It's a cover story to give plausible deniability. And so the two usual extremes of skepticism or it's all literally true miss this third alternative, which I'm proposing is the actual story, is the actual narrative that's going on. And then, of course, we can consider ourselves to still be part of that ongoing network of magical operatives who are attempting to revolutionize human society, covertly or overtly. And that Blavatsky is a figure in that lineage, which we've been spending the last few weeks looking at various figures and movements who can be considered to be part of that. And that the Western esoteric tradition is, in fact, a perfectly real thing, which you can study historically. And so again, the myth of origins obscures that, but so does the skepticism that wants to completely debunk all of it and therefore misses the actual history of stuff that's actually going on. So H.P. Blavatsky, she's born in the Ukrainian territory, and then she begins traveling around the world and goes to India. She's also in Egypt, a number of other places. Eventually, she winds up in New York, and in 1874, she meets her main partner in founding the Theosophical Society, a British gentleman by the name of Henry Steele Olcott. His dates are 1832 to 1907, roughly the same age as Blavatsky. Both of them are in middle age by the time they meet. I think Olcott has a background in the British Army or something like that. Anyway, he's retired at this point, but he's gotten interested in investigating spiritualism. And this is something that is going on in the United States extensively at this time. So it's 1875. This is just a few years after the Civil War. And having seances where you talk to your deceased relatives has become, or you talk to like Socrates or Jesus or other famous people. You can talk to Shakespeare or whatever. This has become a big thing. In fact, Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Lincoln, she was holding seances in the White House during the Civil War, in part because one of her younger children had died of an infection. It was an infected hangnail or something like that. Anyway, it got gangrenous, and one of her children died, and she was really devastated by this. And so she was having mediums come to the White House and holding seances to get into communication with her deceased child to make sure that they were okay in the afterlife, stuff like that. She was subsequently duped after Lincoln died by some like spirit photographers who would do this exposure technique to make they take a photograph of you and then they would re-expose the negative to some other accomplice who would appear in the background, as if there were a spirit or ghost that would seem to appear when they developed the photograph. And this also became a big a big thing as a kind of con act at the time. But there's a lot of mediums going around for money, getting paid big money to put on seances. And so many of these people are getting debunked because they're basically using stage magic techniques to produce their phenomenon. But there's also a belief by many of the people investigating there might be something to it. Anyway, again, a lot of this has to do with the enormous slaughter that occurred during the Civil War, when basically about 250,000 people killed each other in battle during the war. And so it's this huge devastation. And so people are, many families had lost family members during the war and the fighting, both in the North and the South. And so during the period of Reconstruction, there's a great deal of interest in trying to assuage people's concern about their loved ones who had died. So what happens is that Blavatsky is both promoting herself as a medium and also as somebody who's a critic of other mediums. And the ambiguity of that is typical of Blavatsky. She was not afraid to use stage magic or all kinds of techniques, the common stock and trade of other mediums to produce, prestidigitate phenomenon for people in order to impress them, to get their attention. And the idea was that her justification for doing this is that this then allowed her to promote the esoteric teachings and ideas that she had learned in India and elsewhere, that she considered to be legitimate spiritual teachings that it was her mission to promote as part of this network of adepts that she had gotten in contact with internationally and built up connections with during her years of more or less clandestine travels around the world. And so she saw herself as an agent of the Hermetic mysteries, as an adept, and that it was her job to promote those teachings. And so she saw the interest in spiritualism as an opportunity, where if she could basically involve herself in it, she could out-medium the other mediums. But then at the same time, promote, by doing that, what she considered to be the real teachings. So there's a kind of a split here, what Jocelyn Godwin describes as a split between what you could call occultism versus spiritualism. Now, these two also overlap significantly, but there's a difference in emphasis here. And basically the way it works is this: if spiritualism is focused on communication with the dead, what Blavatsky's teaching was that, and she got this idea from Eliphas Levi, who we looked at last week, when mediums were communicating with spirits, what was really going on is that you were not communicating with the actual soul of a deceased person, because that had ascended to another plane and wasn't accessible. But instead, what was happening is you were communicating with the remains of a kind of astral shell that was left over, a kind of ghostly remnant that was not itself fully conscious, but nevertheless had a kind of automatic or unconscious residue of the personality of the original person. And that this is what you were in communication with when you were holding seances. And then the idea is that if you could kind of lead people away from a kind of literal interpretation of spiritualistic phenomenon, you could then get them interested in Hermeticism and some kind of approach to practical occultism, to actually cultivating the various magical powers and human potential in your own person, rather than looking for that in another world that you were communicating with. So Blavatsky's agenda is ultimately magical in that sense. And also her other agenda at this point is Charles Darwin had published The Origin of Species in 1859. And so the early theosophical doctrines were an attempt to replace biological evolution with an ideal of spiritual evolution, where the effects of subtle occult planes of reality would explain the transformations, the evolution of the human body and stuff like that over periods of geological time, and that this would the activity of these supernatural or hypernatural activity would provide an explanatory mechanism for evolution that would be distinct from natural selection, which Blavatsky was concerned was too materialist, was just the contingent effects of physical nature, and didn't allow for higher occult purposes that she felt that she represented. So she founds the Theosophical Society in 1875 in New York with Henry Steele Olcott. Now, technically, Olcott is the president of the society, and Blavatsky is what's called the corresponding secretary. So she, throughout her life, was the primary source of the teachings of the Theosophical Society, but she was technically not herself the leadership of the society. That was handled by Olcott and other organizers. And Blavatsky was a prolific letter writer, and she would stay in correspondence with all these people, and she would promote her own teaching through this network of lodges or circles of correspondence that quickly became a big international phenomenon. Her main work during this period, which was published in 1877, was a work called Isis Unveiled. It's her first major book, which is an attack on so-called materialism, by which she means the kind of reductive rationalism being promoted at that time. Remember, this is before the revolution in physics carried out by Einstein and his collaborators in the early 20th century. And so the type of physical sciences that are predominant in the late 19th century is a kind of reductive and deterministic materialism, at least in many cases. And this is opposed in philosophy by something often called either idealism or vitalism, of which theosophical occult science can be considered to be a variety of it, which attempted to, and these movements attempt to find alternative explanations for physical phenomena that don't involve reductive materialist determinism. Often they're an attempt to reintroduce concepts of free will. So, figures like Henry Bergson, Eliphas Levi, that we already looked at, and of course Blavatsky herself, and there's many other philosophical representatives of this. And often a key idea, and this is part of theosophy as well, is that the human form possesses subtle energy bodies that are made up of more subtle matter than that can be empirically observed through the physical senses, although it can be observed through imaginative faculties. And these are often called the vital energies of the body. Sometimes this is called the etheric body. And then there's also, this would be like the vital living energies of the body, sometimes called chi or prana. This is identified with these historical concepts of either the Chinese or Indian Vedic systems of philosophy. And then also there's the notion that there's this thing called the astral body or the astral plane, which is an idea that develops out of Eliphas Levi's writings in particular, although there's other sources. And this is the idea that your thoughts or your mind or your soul has its own body, distinct from the physical body, that can be separated and can project itself to different locations, perhaps materialize itself, cause various types of effects, and that you could communicate at long distances with mysterious adepts in like Tibet or something like that through astral projection. And of course, this becomes a technique that's practiced in both the Golden Dawn and, of course, in the Thelemic tradition as well. So all this is going on in the theory that's being presented in Isis Unveiled, this book she writes in 1877. So she's opposing reductive materialism in favor of what she calls occult science, which is a term that was introduced in Eliphas Levi. And what's interesting about Isis Unveiled is that it's focused on mostly Western sources, namely Hermeticism and Neoplatonism. And at this time, she's holding seances with two masters by the name of Serapis Bey and Twitet Bey. And these are identified as members of something called the Brotherhood of Luxor, or the Universal Mystic Brotherhood. And this is said to be located either in Egypt or hidden somewhere like in the Black Forest in Central Europe, and linked to the Rosicrucian order. And so these are initially the sources said to be the sources for Blavatsky's teachings. In 1879, Blavatsky and Olcott relocate the headquarters of the Theosophical Society to India, first in Bombay, what's now called Mumbai, and then they have several visits to Simla. Simla is the colonial headquarters of the British Raj. Remember that India, as well as many other territories in the world, are controlled by the British Empire at this time. So this is the high watermark of British colonialism. More on that in a moment. And then eventually the Theosophical Society, gets ownership of a compound in Adyar in India. And in 1882, the headquarters of the Theosophical Society is moved there. Now, once she's in India, there's a kind of shift in emphasis in the teachings of the Theosophical Society towards away from Western esoteric background, which doesn't go away, but is now folded within or incorporated within Eastern teachings that relate specifically to Vedanta and more specifically to Buddhism, specifically Mahayana Buddhism. And in 1880, Blavatsky and Olcott both convert to Buddhism. And this is important because they do this during a visit to Sri Lanka, where they're met with huge crowds. And this leads to a major revival of the indigenous Theravadan tradition in Sri Lanka, which turns out to be historically quite important to the ongoing relevance of Buddhism in the 20th and 21st centuries as well. So for example, the mindfulness tradition that's quite popular in the United States derives from teachers in Sri Lanka, which their teachers, the fact that this movement exists in Sri Lanka is in part due to the influence of the Theosophical Society in India at that time. And of course, there's a significant influence on indigenous revival movements, both within Hinduism and Buddhism in India itself. And part of what's important about the Theosophical Society is it's by no means a white order, although there's a lot of Europeans who are involved in it. The Theosophical Society accepted memberships of any race or caste, and they're a surprisingly integrated, racially integrated organization, for a 19th century organization at this time. And I think it's important to keep that in mind for reasons which we'll be getting to. And so now Blavatsky is saying that her masters are now secret Mahatmas, or masters that are based in Tibet, which at that time was not accessible. You couldn't really get into it. And they're part of this thing called the Great White Brotherhood. And they're hidden in the Himalayan mountains. And there's several masters, but two of the main ones are called Kut, Humi, and Moira. And now they're the main central figures. And she begins to facilitate the communication of these two masters to members of the Theosophical Society to deliver what, to be frank, are ultimately her own teachings, which are, of course, based on traditional sources, but are highly elaborated in terms of her own system. And this is done through sleight of hand and other types of methods. There's a shrine room at the compound in Adyar, where she has this kind of sliding compartment where she can cause messages to magically appear. And sometimes these will appear like hidden in people's pockets, that she uses different sort of sleight of hand methods to deliver these letters. And she's claiming that these are magically materializing as a result of the astral activities of these masters. So she's able to promote her own teachings this way. And she's working on the manuscript of her main body of teachings, which is a book that will eventually be published called The Secret Doctrine, will eventually be published in 1888. So letters from Kut, Humi, and Moira beginning in 1880. A person by the name of Alfred Percy Sinnett, or A.P. Sinnett. His dates are 1840 to 1921. He begins to receive a series of teachings with these letters. They're eventually published in a book called the Mahatma Letters. This edition is from 1926. And Sinnett summarizes the content of these letters in which he receives from 1880 to 1884 in two books. First, a book that was published in 1881 called The Occult World, and then a second book published in 1883 called Esoteric Buddhism. And both of these books cause a sensation in England in particular, and fuel an interest in Theosophy by many people who are intellectually interested in Indian philosophy and spirituality, particularly people who are bored with Christianity or looking for some kind of alternative. Then there's so much interest generated in this that in 1885, there's an investigation of Blavatsky by the Society for Psychical Research. And this is a society that was founded mostly by spiritualists to investigate psychical phenomenon. The importance of this society in the history of cultism, which is significant, is that it was much more, it wasn't for true believers. It was a society that practiced a skeptical and scientific methodology and was concerned with the actual rigorous investigation of claims for psychic phenomena. So it was not out to be conned. It was the membership of the society consisted of people who were legitimately interested in these phenomenon, but they weren't out to be rubes. They were out to actually find out what was going on. And so they sent a delegation to Adyar to investigate Blavatsky's claims. And unfortunately for Blavatsky, they were quickly able to figure out the various stage magical methods that she was using to produce these letters. And Blavatsky was basically exposed as a fraud in that way by the SPR in a report that they published on the subject in 1885. The blowback from that was significant, but also ambiguous. And as a result of that, in 1885, Blavatsky left India, and she eventually, in 1887, settles in London, where she's lives with some very wealthy members of the British aristocracy who were supporters and disciples of hers. And in 1888, she published The Secret Doctrine, which is the major presentation of her mature philosophy and position based on incorporating all of the Eastern teachings that are now part of her system. This is basically her magnum opus. And she also started something called the Esoteric Section of the Theosophical Society, which is a group in London that was an invitational only group where you could basically you would participate in seances that she would hold, where she would again continue to elaborate her teachings. W.B. Yeats, for example, was a member of the Esoteric Section, and a number of other people. And she continued this until eventually she passed away and died in 1891. One of her last major works was called The Voice in the Silence, which was published in 1889, the year after the publication of The Secret Doctrine, which emphasizes Mahayana Buddhism as the ultimate teaching of Theosophy. So the ambiguity of the Society for Psychical Research report and investigation is that it basically divided people into two camps. People who thought Blavatsky was a fraud and had been exposed, and therefore they didn't have to pay attention to her anymore. And then on the other side, the true believers were like, oh no, the SPR report, well, you know, with conspiracy theorists, they always come up with some rationale for why the evidence presented is somehow dubious or can be called into question. And so this caused them, the true believers, to double down on the myth of the Great White Brotherhood, and to not only believe in this, but to consider it to be the central teaching of Theosophy. And therefore, in a way, to kind of de-emphasize the teachings of Theosophy that were about the cultivation of meditation and mysticism, and the comparative religious theories or relationships of that, and which meant that insofar as that was, from Blavatsky's point of view, kind of the importance of what she was actually trying to present or deliver, means that now gets de-emphasized as well in favor of the myth of the masters. There's a fascinating letter that she wrote to Franz Hartmann, someone who was involved also in the early activity of the OTO, and which I think is revealing of Blavatsky's ultimate motivations and reasons why she was up to what she was. This is a letter that's written in 1886. So this is after the SPR investigation and the fallout of that. And she's writing to Franz Hartmann, and she says, where you speak of the army of the deluded and the imaginary Mahatmas of Olcott, you are absolutely and sadly right. Have I not seen the thing for nearly 8 years? Have I not struggled and fought against Olcott's ardent and gushing imagination and tried to stop him every day of my life? Was he not told by me that if he did not see the masters in their true light, he did not cease speaking and inflaming people's imaginations, that he would be held responsible for all the evil the society might come to? Was he not told that there were no such Mahatmas who, Rishi-like, could hold their Mount Meru on the tip of their finger and fly to and fro in their bodies at their will, and who were or were imagined by fools more gods on earth than a god in heaven could be, etc., etc.? All this I saw, foresaw, despaired, fought against, and finally gave up the struggle in utter hopelessness. Well, I told him the whole truth. I said to him that I had known adepts, the brothers, not only in India and beyond Ladakh, but in Egypt and Syria. For there are brothers there to this day. The names of the Mahatmas were not even known at the time, since they are called so only in India, that whether they were called Rosicrucians, Kabbalists, or yogis, adepts were everywhere. Adepts, silent, secret, retiring, and who would never divulge themselves entirely. Olcott became crazy. He was like Balaam's she-ass when she saw the angel. Then came Damodar, Servi, and several other fanatics who began calling them Mahatmas. And little by little, the adepts were transformed into gods on earth. They began to be appealed to and made puja to, and were becoming with every day more legendary and miraculous. I saw with terror and anger the false track they were all pursuing. The masters, as all thought, must be omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent. The idea that the masters were mortal men, limited even in their great powers, never crossed anyone's mind, even though they wrote this themselves repeatedly. Is it Olcott's fault? Perhaps to a degree. Is it mine? I absolutely deny it and protest against the accusation. It is no one's fault. Human nature alone and the failure of modern society and religions to furnish people with something higher and nobler than craving after money and honors is at the bottom of it. Place this failure on one side and the mischief and havoc produced in people's brains by modern spiritualism, and you have the enigma solved. But then Blavatsky also notes, if anyone is to be blamed, it is I. I have desecrated the holy truth by remaining too passive in the face of all this desecration brought on by too much zeal and false ideas. Now, I think that's a terribly revealing letter about Blavatsky's complicity in promoting this mythology of origins to provide a cover story for her teachings, and then discovering at the end of the day that everybody's more interested in the covering myth than in the teachings that she wanted to promote. But you notice something interesting in this letter, which is she says, well, but there are adepts. They're all over the place. I met them all over the world and been in communication with them. Who and what is she actually talking about? Well, in 1994, there was a publication, a wonderful book of scholarship on the origins of the Theosophical Society by K. Paul Johnson, called The Masters Revealed, Madame Blavatsky and the Myth of the Great White Lodge. And here's a typical picture of Blavatsky with her ascended masters around her. And the letter that I was just reading is excerpted in this book. And according to Paul Johnson's research, basically what's going on is that Blavatsky had become associated in her travels around the world with a number of esoteric figures who formed among themselves a kind of international network of circle of correspondence, you could say. And they together had a common ideal, which is, in addition to being interested in esotericism, occult mysteries, and the development of the human potential through magical and mystical practices, they all also had in common basically a politically revolutionary ideal. They were political revolutionaries. They were associated with what we could call the radical enlightenment, meaning that they were opposed to the Christian colonial world empires that were then, particularly the British colonial empire, that they were implacably hostile to Christian missionary activity in colonial areas, particularly in India, but also elsewhere, and that they were promoting, well, let's look at the ideals of the Theosophical Society, and we can see right away what's going on here. Let me share my screen. These are the three main ideals of the Theosophical Society: to form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. So they're ultimately anti-racist and therefore against the prevailing colonial order of white supremacy. The study of ancient and modern religions, philosophy, and sciences. So they're opposed to Christian hegemony. They want to overthrow the idea that Christianity is the one true truth, and that in fact all world religions and spiritualities partake of the human experience. And 3, the investigation of the unexplained laws of nature and the psychical powers latent in man. This is the magical, mystical element. They're concerned with the development of human potential in accord with these cross-cultural techniques, and therefore the defeat of exoteric Christian religion, which is opposed to such practices. Okay, so what that means is that Blavatsky became associated in India with her travels, and this is before already the founding of the Theosophical Society. She's become associated with a number of anti-colonial indigenous nationalist groups, which are more or less involved in secret organization to be involved in what are ultimately anti-colonial revolutionary activities. And this includes a group called the Arya Samaj, which is an Indian nationalist revolutionary group founded by a person by the name of Swami Dayananda Saraswati, and also a person by the name of Thakur Singh Sandhanwali, who is the leader of a group called the Singh Sabha, which is a Sikh and Hindu secret revolutionary society. And Paul Johnson speculates that Thakur Singh is possibly the basis for Koot Humi. And then there's also the Maharaja, or regional ruler of Kashmir, important political figure in India by the name of Ranbir Singh. And he's a religious reformer, supporter of the Theosophical Society, and also somebody who's very much opposed to Christian missionary activity in India, someone who polemicizes against that, someone who's also involved in Indian nationalism, and he's probably the basis for the figure of Moira. Now, when Paul Johnson is associating these two revolutionary figures, Indian nationalist figures, with Koot Humi and Moira, he's not claiming that they're the authors of the Mahatma letters, but he is claiming that Blavatsky considers herself to be on a kind of, she's a spy, she's an anti-colonial revolutionary in India. And so she's promoting those activities, which of course she can't talk about directly. And she's creating the idea of the Mahatmas as a kind of cover story so that she can be involved in Indian nationalist anti-colonial activity. And in fact, the Theosophical Society continues to be involved in Indian nationalism and anti-colonial activity, and has a close association with the Indian National Congress, which is part of the Indian independence movement that, say, Mahatma Gandhi is one of the main leaders of later on. And the later subsequent post-Blavatsky leadership of the society, particularly Annie Besant, continue to be more or less publicly, but also covertly as well, involved in anti-colonial religious activity. And this is important because it accounts for the meaning of Blavatsky's anti-Christianity. The reason she's so implacably opposed to Christian exotericism specifically. Why? Because it's part of her anti-colonialism. She's in fact a political revolutionary who's promoting ideals of universal brotherhood and democracy. And this is part of what her occult activity is about. And this is what the realization of human potential that's supposed to be accorded by the practice of what she calls practical occultism, which she feels is spiritualism is providing an opportunity for people to come into contact with these ideas, but is also deflecting them away from it. And so she's trying to run this kind of front organization, the TS, to then introduce these ideas into Western societies, but also be involved in Eastern reform movements within India itself, with indigenous actors who are also attempting to be part of this international anti-colonial network of illumination, basically, that's going on in the late 19th century. And so that's the reason she can't be completely open about her activities, because it would expose the activities of indigenous revolutionary operatives that she's in communication with. And so she has to um, not disclose their identity, but instead talk about these Mahatmas, but then the myth takes over. Um, so there's this Tibetan cover story to conceal the political anti-colonial activities of the real masters who are out and about. Um, and so um, I guess what you could say from this is that the Great White Brotherhood is, in fact, a real network of actual adepts embodying the spirit of human wisdom. And that was the case then as it is now. Um, and so, again, the myth of origins tends to conceal the actual reality of what is and has been going on, that in a way we're still part of. We're still part of this. And I hope this has become clearer in the last few weeks as we've been going over these earlier movements. Recall even back to the Rosicrucian manifestos, which are an attempt to overthrow the tyranny of the Habsburg Catholic Counter-Reformation, for example. And so there's this sort of liberative thread represented by a certain type of Western esotericism that's going on through all of these movements that involves a kind of radical politics. And this is where Crowley's connection to Theosophy becomes important, because his own anti-Christianity is also tied to this anti-colonial element that's coming from Blavatsky. And it's important to, I think, recognize that, because it connects the mission of Thelema to the mission of Theosophy, to the mission of Rosicrucianism, as an ultimately radical political agenda that's opposed to what we would now today call Christian nationalism, but in the past was Christian colonialism, or could be called the Catholic or Christian absolutism of the earlier modern period, these totalitarian movements that are out to oppress humanity. And there's this, throughout all of this period, there's been the activity of esoteric adepts who have been opposed to that. And that's why it's all the more important to recognize this today, when there continue to be also an esoteric right, which if you want to, you can associate with the so-called Black Lodge or whatever. But again, this is the myth that needs to be handled with kid gloves so we don't get too caught up in it. It's a metaphor for what turns out to actually be a historical reality of the struggle of humanity to realize our historical potential in modern times, of which there are these reactionary elements that want to pull us back into superstition and ignorance. And magic and mysticism are ultimately tools to develop and liberate humanity and realize our human potential. And Crowley, as a secret master, is one of these adepts who's part of that movement, just as Blavatsky does, or is part of. And but there's also these countervailing movements that attempt to again take the side of human limitation. So I think if we can get the what I've been trying to do here in this class is to get kind of the narrative straight of what's actually going on. And so we can see the way that this connects potentially to our own current activity, the way Thelema is carrying forward an emancipatory lineage of ideas that relates to these earlier phases of Western esotericism. Okay, so that's the basic narrative of how to interpret this idea of the Great White Brotherhood, which is, of course, in Thelema also the ideal of the AA, also called, not by coincidence, the Great White Brotherhood, which is concerned with the liberation of humanity from ignorance, the realization of human potential, and is opposed by the forces of ignorance and superstition. I do also want to say something about the actual teachings of Blavatsky, the secret doctrine, if you will, but we're coming up on 3 o'clock, and so I do want to pause for a moment and because we've just covered a whole bunch of material, and see if there's any questions or comments. We can take about 10 or 15 minutes to talk about that before I say a few things more about what the actual secret doctrine, what Blavatsky's actual mystical teachings are. So, Luke, did you have any questions, comments, reflections about what we've just been talking about? Just want to check in with you because I've been doing a lot of talking. Go ahead.
Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you just fine. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm a little tired because it's late here in Germany. But I'm just wondering, how was Blavatsky like? I hear that AC there was like a kind of ambiguous relationship between AC and Blavatsky, and like, did they ever meet at some point and actually discuss things directly, or was it more of a exchange in a literary or intellectual way through letters or?
They never met. Um, Crowley was too young to directly meet Blavatsky. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which we'll be talking more about next week, was um, founded to be a kind of competitor organization for Blavatsky's esoteric section. And so there was some overlap of membership between some of the founding or important members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and people who knew Blavatsky or were associated with her in London during the period she was running the esoteric section. Um, Remember that she dies in 1891 and Crowley isn't initiated into the Golden Dawn, I think, until 1897 or 98. So
Right.
he was still like, in the British equivalent of high school. Um, he was still an adolescent when she passed away and hadn't quite emancipated himself from his family situation, his involvement in the particular type of evangelical Christianity that was part of his youth.
Right.
So Blavatsky had already passed away by the time that Crowley was getting interested in alchemy and magic and joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Now, one of the important members of the London Temple, the Isis Urania Temple
Hmm.
of the Golden Dawn, the premonstrator or chief adept of that temple was the poet William Butler Yeats, who subsequently
Yeah.
won the Nobel Prize for Literature and was an important Anglo-Irish poet and intellectual, actually a major figure in modernism. And he had been friends with Blavatsky and tells the story about how he would visit her and she would lay out tarot cards and
Hmm.
she had this kind of salon that she would receive visitors at. She often had this she would have this salon that she would set up that would be filled with like little Buddha statues or other types of have like incense smoke going and be this kind of like, because she was all about, even though she was a critic of spiritualism, she was always promoting herself as if she was like the supreme medium.
Yeah.
And so she would always have these kind of trappings around her, like being the big mysterious figure. And so there were a number of occasions where uh, W.B. Yeats would basically come over for tea, and she would put on her performance of herself, where she would come into the room and she would have like a turban on and do the tarot cards and give them a reading. And she would, talk about and Yeats was a member of the esoteric section, and what that involved is these were usually texts or commentaries associated with her book, The Secret Doctrine, and she would basically talk about this sevenfold correspondence system that she had, which I might as well put on the screen at this point.
Hmm.
And here it is. So there's seven components to the subtle anatomy. This is the Theosophical Septenary. It always has the sevenfold scheme to it. So there's the physical body, and then there's the which is called the Rupa, And then there's the prana or jiva, which is the etheric body. And then there's the astral body, which is called the linga sharira, excuse me. And then there's what's called the animal soul, or the body of desire, the kama rupa. And then there's this thing called the higher or spiritual intelligence, which is called the manas, which is the human soul. And then there's the spiritual soul, which is called the buddhi, and then the pure spirit, which is called the atma. These categories are developed with extreme elaboration by Blavatsky, particularly in her book, The Secret Doctrine. And what that book also has is this enormous prehistory, and a lot of this is based on, or at least inspired by, Mahayana Buddhist texts, which have these elaborate cosmological schemas, where these earlier universes that arise out of the shunyata, the void, and
yeah, like the kalpas, or
the kalpas, yeah. And
right.
so in Blavatsky's system, there's like sequences of 7 kalpas that then have 7 sub kalpas, that then there's various like what are called root races, which are these and then there's development of various of these 7 soul sheaths through each of these sub kalpas, and then different planetary bodies within the solar system go through 7-fold cycles, and it's all extremely complicated and elaborated.
I think, doesn't like Steiner also touch a lot on this?
Yes, Anthroposophy develops these, and then there's Atlantean and Lemurian civilizations that precede the current epoch. And so in the ancient Lemurian civilization, for example, the previous incarnated bodies that human souls are part of are like, they're green skinned and have no hair, and they're 16 feet tall, and they have 4 arms and a third eye. And their soul isn't fully, their rational soul isn't fully developed. So they have a civilization, but all the buildings that they build are just built by intuition, like bees build beehives out of a kind of animal instinct and not through intelligence. And so the Lemurians had a kind of and then there's the Atlanteans later, who have a civilization based on magic, but then that declines and is then replaced by descent into more, and these earlier eras are supposed to be made out of more subtle matter than the present, and so they're somehow, the earth is somehow dematerialized or halfway on the astral plane as well, and then it becomes more material later in the current historical period, and so on and so forth. So these are all, but then that raises the interesting question, given all this stuff that's sort of going on within this esoteric cosmos that has all these subtle sheaths, what the ultimate absolute or highest kind of concept of the divine is for Blavatsky. So let me quote from you a letter that she wrote in 1880. This is included in Jocelyn Godwin's The Theosophical Enlightenment. Wonderful book, by the way, highly recommend it. So she writes as a benighted Buddhist and the corresponding secretary of the Theosophical Society, New York, January 23rd, 1877. And she says, excuse me, this letter, I said a moment ago that this letter is 1880. I'm misreading that. This letter is from 1877. So she's still in the United States at this point. So she says, let us settle once and for all, if you please, as to the word spiritualist. I am not one, not at least in the modern and American sense of the word. I am a Svabhavika, a Buddhist pantheist, if anything at all. I do not believe in a personal God, in a direct creator or a supreme. Neither do I confess to a first cause, which implies the possibility of a last one. And if so, then what comes next? I believe in but one eternal, indestructible substance, the Svabhavat, or invisible, all-pervading matter, whether you call it God or many gods in partnership. If the reporter, the author of the article in question, had simply said that I belong to the religion that inspired the Buddha, instead of presenting me to the public as a Buddhist turning the wheel of the law, he would have spoken nothing but the truth. Now, of course, a few years later, she does formally convert to Buddhism. Okay, so what's she saying here? She's saying that she doesn't believe in a personal God, so she's an atheist, but she's also not a deist either. So she doesn't believe in a impersonal deity either. So instead, her ultimate principle is basically similar to the Buddhist notion of shunyata, or void or nothingness, which is an ultimately indescribable and unconscious reality. And so what is basically her ultimate principle is she calls herself a pantheist. What she means is that this cosmic single substance, and she's remember we were talking about this a little bit with Eliphas Levi, where he talks about the astral light as an all-pervading cosmic spiritual medium. And this ultimately derives from the Neoplatonic idea of the world soul, that is where the cosmos is ensouled, that was revived in modern times by Marsilio Ficino. But she's also rejecting the Neoplatonic idea of the that there's a separate ultimate unity of being that's separate from reality or physical reality, which is emanated from that. She's saying that there's just this cosmic reality that includes all of the subtle planes of reality, and it's this one pervading magical and mystical substance, and that you can't talk about the ultimate unity or absoluteness of that in terms that are either personal or impersonal. So she's appealing to the Buddhist absolute, which is beyond linguistic description. Now, what I think is interesting about that is that this is actually very similar to Crowley's own position in Barsheath, an essay on ontology, where he also takes the Buddhist concept of shunyata, or nothingness, as something like his absolute, although he's also mediating that with something he calls the Kabbalistic nothingness, or zero, which is a nothingness that he says is actually nothing, meaning that it has to be considered non-dual with the apparent world of duality of appearances as well. And so you can't conceive of it either as being the unity of reality, or as a separate absolute reality that can be considered separate from the cosmos either. So it's neither a personal nor an impersonal absolute. And so this gets us very close, I think, to Crowley's conception of the 0 = 2 formula. And this, I think, is one of the important links between Aleister Crowley's thought and Blavatsky's philosophy. Not necessarily what the Theosophical Society was promoting as its philosophy at the time that Crowley is formulating his own philosophy, but in a way he's looking back to Blavatsky, but then attempting to weed out the confusions that have occurred around her philosophy subsequently. So I would say that there's two main threads that are coming out of Theosophy into Thelema, which are, first of all, anti-Christianity, focused on opposition, particularly to Christianity as the religion of colonial imperialism, particularly in the British Empire. And secondly, an attempt to liberate humanity from that ideologically oppressive hegemony as the mission of magically enlightened adepts. And second of all, a further philosophical development of Blavatsky's ultimately Buddhist concept of the absolute as distinct from either Neoplatonism or monotheism, as kind of two other alternative philosophical concepts of the absolute within the already existing Western esoteric or Hermetic tradition. And so those are two threads that Crowley is continuing of Theosophy, but I would also argue that there's a break, that Thelema represents a kind of break with Theosophy as well. And the place where there's the break is in the notion of occult science as an equivalent mode of what you could call positivism in terms of the way that it's meant to replace Darwinian evolution and the reductive materialist sciences of the late 19th century. And what's going on with Crowley is that you're moving into a new period where the new physics are emerging with Einstein. Special relativity is published in 1904, the same year as the reception of the Book of the Law. And basically, Einstein is consolidating a new paradigm in physics that will eventually evolve into general relativity and quantum mechanics, where the reductive Newtonian deterministic universe is fundamentally broken and exploded and cast aside. And there's a new paradigm of physics, which is fundamentally probabilistic and therefore can incorporate a concept of free will or human self-determination that is able to articulate an understanding of the universe that does in fact overcome the reductive materialism. That scientific paradigm is overcome by the new physics in the 20th century. And so, but what that also means is that Crowley is concerned to promote a skeptical methodology that is not so incredulous or so for example, Crowley is a Darwinian. He asserts that human biological evolution through natural selection is the case. He accepts that that's a finding of science, and so he doesn't need to provide an occult alternative to that, and so he accepts the legitimacy of science and the physical sciences kind of on their own terms, particularly in the new interesting way that they're being developed in the 20th century, particularly with relativity, special and general relativity as they're being developed. And so he's able to also make a break with the kind of incredulity that the Theosophical movement has towards always kind of mucking about for occult phenomenon and coming up with relatively preposterous schemes to replace the natural sciences of their time, which are admittedly limited, and they were searching for alternatives. But those alternatives eventually arrive. It's just that they arrive through a critique that's going on within the sciences that doesn't require these schemes of subtle anatomy or cosmic cycles to be necessarily taken literally as theosophists. So you don't have to believe in Atlantis or Lemuria to practice magic and mysticism for Crowley. Those can be interesting legends, that are part of different mythologies that you're building up in terms of your understanding of symbolism. But you don't have to go on these flights of fancy where you're developing these really kind of absurdly elaborated cosmic schemas of these past, like kalpas and world ages and so forth, that especially under the leadership in the Theosophical Society that follows Blavatsky's death, it's led by Annie Besant and C.W. Ledbetter, these become so complicated that they become absurd. And kind of it becomes this theosophical doctrine becomes this house of cards that falls apart. And because everybody's looking to try to replace the natural sciences with occult science and it doesn't work out, and then they've got these mysterious Mahatmas that turn out to be a hoax, and then what have you got left? And so Crowley is coming along later. You say, well, you've got plenty left. You've got the development of human potential through the practice of magic and mysticism, and you've got the mission of magic, which is human emancipation. And that can then become the basis of Thelema. And you can see Theosophy as this kind of stepping stone towards that, but you can let go of the dogmatism, of the occult fundamentalism that, as I was reading this letter from Blavatsky earlier, she herself recognized that there'd been this mistake and that the TS had gone down this, and she'd become trapped by the myth that she had herself created as a cover for teachings that people were then not following or investigating because they'd gotten on this other track. And that was just supposed to be a cover story for this other thing that was supposed to happen, and everybody got distracted. And then she's trying to get things back on track with the esoteric section with the promotion of her teachings and the secret doctrine. But then it's groups like the Golden Dawn who are then carrying forward that thread. And the Theosophical Society continues to get off track with Mahatma mongering and all this kind of stuff, and cults of personality around theosophical leaders who are allegedly in contact with these masters, but then it all turns into this fraud. And by the Second World War, the Theosophical Society is basically no longer culturally relevant. But then modern magical movements like Thelema or neo-paganism that are based on basically Thelemic magic or the ideals of that, with figures like Gerald Gardner or whatever, they're continuing the practice of magic, and also the now post-colonial rather than anti-colonial, because the colonial empires break up in the first two world wars. But then there's the ongoing negative legacy of colonialism as our societies continue to be mired in prejudice and racism and other forms of limited ideologies, that then it continues to be appropriate to fight back against in favor of the ongoing relevance of the radical enlightenment that's at the core, I'm claiming, of the magical and mystical traditions of Western esotericism. Luke, did that answer your question or address the issues you have? Feel free to ask some more.
Yeah, more than thanks.
I mean, that's my own agenda in these classes, is to promote this particular ideal. There is a conservative wing of occultism that's going on in the late 19th and early 20th century. That's what's called traditionalism. It's associated with René Guénon, Fridtjof Schuon, and a number of other figures,
Yeah,
who are, of course, initially. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I've had some contact with some of those, so that's always
yes. There may be a little bit more dominant right now in Europe than in the United States, which tends to have a lot of witches running around. But witchcraft is kind of the main popular thing in the United States. But in Europe, there's a lot of interest in esotericism that relates to a lot of assumptions or theories that are really coming out of the traditionalists. Julius Evola, for example, was an Italian fascist magician who has some influence. And what they've done is, although they were initially critics of Theosophy because they recognized that Blavatsky was this covert radical, they've since reincorporated a number of theosophical doctrines to try to again promote a version of esotericism, which is again promotes it as a kind of because there's different kinds of enlightenment. There's what I'm calling the radical enlightenment, which is about democracy and overcoming prejudice and racism, and promoting the idea of human brotherhood, or the ultimate relevance of all human cultures to the conversation of human society. But there's also the
counter kind of
the
conservative revolution and all that. Like it's kind of going, it's taking like the kind of foil to this enlightenment idea, is as in like through the Reformation, kind of there was this like falling back, like
with Calvinism, for example, which creates what you could call totalitarianism, which is the other legacy of the Enlightenment, which is various modern totalitarian movements, which are attempts to reinstantiate the organic hierarchical traditions of pre-modern societies, and try to where the proliferation of human diversity in modern times is seen as bad or wrong, and there's an attempt to return to some kind of alleged natural hierarchy, often based on race or class divisions. And where I see Crowley's contribution to this is an attempt to break out of that, and instead of the organic hierarchical ordering of traditionalism, to instead be open to the anarchy of being in modern experience, where
Yeah,
there's a
definitely.
kind of liberative open horizon where all of us can pursue our true will as unique entities, but then we have this broader conversation that we can be part of as a kind of what's called the company of heaven, where we're all stars in the body of meat, where we do form one ultimately human community, but it's a community based on diversity, not on the superimposition of a totalitarian unity. And that
Yeah,
struggle continues
definitely.
between these two ideologies, especially in esoteric circles as well. So I'm sure you're
Yeah,
probably
definitely.
already
It's
aware.
I thought it was really interesting. Like, I just read recently that like Rene Guénon was actually part of the Martinist order at some point, and then he got this revelation of like Michael telling him to drop, like to like convert to Islam or something, and then he was like
Yes,
kicked out by that. Like,
it's not
yeah,
coincidental that Islam becomes something that a lot of traditionalists are interested in, because it's uh, traditional Islamic societies have been relatively more resistant to modernization than other forms of indigenous experience. And so they sort of
yeah,
latch onto that as, oh, here's a place where we can resist modernization. But I think that what Blavatsky and Crowley and Gardner in a certain way, but um, the the legacy of the radical enlightenment is a realization that we can't go back to the past, that
yeah,
the medieval world order has been fundamentally disrupted, and so the only way um, modernity is definitely ambiguous and problematic, but the only way to deal with it is to move forward, is to not to try to go back and restore this myth of the so for example, T.S. Eliot, who's is a conservative intellectual,
mhm,
um, was concerned. He thought that the most interesting period of modernity for him was the restoration of the monarchy after the English Civil War, with Milton as the major poet during that period, because he's interested in the arts, particularly poetry. But the problem with that is that it's an attempt to restore the medieval monarchy after it had broken down in the English Civil War, when they chopped Charles I's head off. And what they're chopping with is the head that's getting chopped off is the brain in that head thinks that um, absolutist monarchy is the only legitimate political system, and to the point where the parliament was the king waged war against his own parliament, against his own people, to um, try to assert his sovereignty. And this becomes so intolerable that eventually they defeat him in a war where he brings in foreign mercenaries and they have to cut his head off. And then the um, things don't work out, and they eventually bring back the monarch. But then that breaks down again in the 1680s, with what's called the Glorious Revolution. And finally, at that point, they established the first modern constitutional monarchy in Europe. Um, and this will, of course, be the basis for then the American Revolution, where they get rid of the aristocracy entirely. And then this becomes the basis for then the later democratic revolutions um, throughout the world subsequently. T.S. Eliot is looking back to saying, no, we should have kept the monarch somehow. And why? Why is this? do you see what I'm saying? It's
right.
um,
It's like,
this attempt to return to earlier class systems that no longer correspond to the economic reality that we're in. Because the reason you had a monarch and aristocracy is that these were basically robber barons who took control of certain territories to then control the agricultural production there and get a tithe, or to
right.
steal the surplus value being produced from the agricultural labor of certain territories of the peasants there as their subjects. And the difficulty is that that system can never return in its original form because we no longer have an agrarian economy. We now have a capitalist, industrialized economy where the money you make is through capital investment, not through controlling land that you then, tax the agricultural production on. That's not where wealth comes from anymore.
Right.
So the economic undergirding of this feudal caste system no longer exists in modern societies. And so you can't go back to it because the economic basis for that doesn't exist anymore. You have to do something else. But then people get this nostalgia for the past because there's a disruption in modern experience of the unilateral value systems that were part of the traditional societies. And that's great because that's conducive to pluralistic societies and democratic culture, and ultimately the recognition that we all have our kind of unique mode of self-expression that we want to promote and develop. And all these versions to reestablish either fascist or traditionalist modes of attempting to go back to this organic hierarchical traditionalism are doomed to fail, but they are all the more persistent precisely for that reason, because people get this nostalgia. They don't like
That's
the
really
diversity
kind of
that's around them. Go ahead.
kind of almost like just a nihilist cop-out, or like
Yes.
it turns into a kind of nihilism at some point.
Yes, and then it turns into like domestic terrorism because it's like, well, we're going to like sacrifice ourselves to this unrealizable ideal, and then that's our authenticity. And I think that's all a false path. And better to see these movements as in the past, and embrace the admitted ambiguity of the diversity of modern experience. And then there's a dialogue or conversation that can occur in that context where we can come into meaningful social relations with each other and do all kinds of interesting stuff. But this kind of fascist impulse to try to have some kind of doomed authority figure who's going to reunify, get rid of the outsiders, or punish the the people who aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, or find scapegoat groups, whether that's immigrants of whatever type, that are going to get them or whatever. This is all a false path, and I think the true initiates need to fight back in our subtle ways against those impulses, those darker impulses of what you could call, was the metaphor, the Black Lodge or whatever. But there are powerful magicians who are part of that. Julius Evola is this fascist sorcerer. That Steve Bannon, who is a supporter of Donald Trump, was a reader of Julius Evola.
Yeah, I've heard of that too.
So he's also a kind of magician. And so these agents are active in the world, but of course, the people who are on the side of liberation, the genuine liberation of humanity, we also have our agents in the field. And so there's this kind of secret war that does continue. And I don't mean that in a necessarily like spooky conspiratorial way, but I do refer to this actual conflict in history that's bound up with the experience of modernity, which is to realize the human potential that's possible in modern experience, or the other possibility, which is human oppression and totalitarianism, which is also a possibility of modern experience. We're coming up on 3:30. Luke or Taryn, do you have any further comments or quick things you want to say before we close up? Thanks, Luke, for your comments. Taryn, go ahead.
No, just wanted to say thank you again for the class, as always.
Okay, great. We're going to talk next week about, it's the final class for this series. We're going to talk about the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and the way that this magical society is this powerful synthesis of all the stuff that came before it in this really important, creative, useful, interesting synthesis. and the best way to interpret the mix of stuff that's going on there to get the best out of that. And of course, how that leads directly into Thelemic spirituality and Aleister Crowley and what he's about. So I encourage people to join me for that. That'll be in 1 week, and we'll close out this course with that. Thanks everybody for joining us. Love is the law, love under will. Everybody have a nice week. Okay.